All right, so one day, Jesus was extremely frustrated. Just so frustrated, like maybe the most frustrated he ever gets. And if Jesus doesn't live in a state of aggravation. He doesn't live like angry. That's one of the things I think is really amazing about Jesus. When you look at his ministry, that like, he has reason to be angry all the time, and almost never is he angry. But there are times when he gets angry, and there are definitely times where it comes out, and there's definitely times when he's frustrated and it comes out. And this is one of those times where he is just maybe more frustrated or at kind of his wit's end with a group of people in a way that he almost never is. And the reason is simple. This particular group of people that he was very upset with was the group of people that had seen and witnessed and experienced more of Jesus' ministry than anyone else. They had heard more teaching than anyone else. They had seen more miracles than anyone else. And they had all of this, I mean, just what an amazing, beautiful experience of seeing all this and hearing all this from Jesus. And they experienced just all of this. And they just didn't believe. And Jesus was so frustrated with them because they had seen and heard all this stuff, and they just didn't believe. Now, understand that Jesus is infinitely patient with people who are struggling. I think that's something that we really need to address before we say anything else in this whole message, because I don't want us to walk away and say, "Oh man, Jesus was really, really frustrated with somebody, people who were, trying hard and couldn't get it." Nope, the disciples show us over 3 years that if you're trying, that Jesus will be infinitely patient with you. If you have even give just the bare minimum effort to try to be somebody who believes or is faithful or, anything, just understands, Jesus understands and he gets it, okay? But what was happening with this group of people, with this city, with this, community of Jewish folks, was they weren't trying. They'd been given more than anyone else had been given. They'd experienced more than anyone else had experienced. And instead of, trying to think for just like 5 minutes about it, they were putting their head on the stand. They were sticking their fingers in their ears and singing, la, 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 we don't want to listen. And so they were getting absolutely nowhere. And Jesus was getting nowhere with them. And so on this particular day, Jesus, dealing with these very frustrating people, these people that he has preached to, these people he has performed miracles for and in the midst of, these people who had just experienced everything that anyone should experience to understand Jesus, and just were sticking their heads in the sand. On this particular day, Jesus decided to say something mean to them. Jesus got a little bit mean. And this is what we read Jesus said that was mean in the gospel according to Matthew. It goes like this. Jesus began to denounce the towns where he had done so many of his miracles because they hadn't repented of their sins and turned to God. And he said, "You people of Capernaum, will you be honored in heaven? No, you will go down to the place of the dead, for if the miracles I did for you had been done in wicked Sodom, it would still be here today. So I tell you, even Sodom will be better off on Judgment Day than you." That's really mean. It's really mean because he brought up Sodom, as in Sodom of Sodom and Gomorrah, as in, that extremely very famous story that everyone knows. And in fact, they knew it way better than we did. They understood, in a heartbeat what Jesus was getting at. For you and I, we might need a bit of a reminder as to why this is so mean. So let's pause for a second and say, okay, what is Sodom? Who is Sodom? And why is that actually so mean? You probably heard the story. You probably think you know the story. Let's just make sure we go over it real quick so everybody gets it, okay? Cool. All right. So last week, we talked about a guy named Abraham. Abraham was the very first person that we could consider to either be Jewish or Hebrew or, one of God's chosen people in the way that we understand, from the Old Testament. And as we talked about, God had called Abraham out of his home, away from his family, away from his religion, away from his homeland, away from his culture, away from his traditions, and said, "I want you to live a new life, a different life, a set-apart life, a holy life, And in return, what I will do is I will make you a great nation. God looked at Abraham and he said, you can look to the sky, you can look at the stars, and your descendants will be more than the stars in the sky. Okay. And as we talked about, that was all well and good, except for Sarah, his wife, couldn't conceive. She was barren. They couldn't have a child. And so for like decades, it was this whole traumatic experience of them trying to believe God's promises, trying to believe that God was actually, who he said he was, while in fact, having virtually no evidence that is tangible that God actually is who he says he is. So, as we talked about, because last week we talked about the Abraham-Isaac thing, eventually Sarah does have a child. Eventually she does have a baby. And before she has that baby, Abraham and Sarah have this visit from 3 angels of the Lord. They look just like men. It's sort of unclear exactly when and how much Abraham knows, when he figures out exactly that they're angels. He seems to figure it out at some point, but we're not totally sure. But so these angels show up. They're dressed as men. We're just going to call them angels for the sake of simplicity. So the angels show up, and Abraham's like, hey, men that are visiting, come on in, let's have a meal, let's sit down, welcome. This is what I do. In their culture, in their world, hospitality was a very, very big deal because it was a very, very unsafe world. And so finding a person who cared about you enough to take you in, give you a hot meal, that was just the best. And so these 3 strangers show up. Abraham brings them in, gives them a hot meal. They're talking. One of the angels says, by the way, we're going to visit again in a year. At that point, we're going to meet your son. It's going to be really cool. Sarah is super skeptical. She laughs. It's this whole thing. That becomes a big piece of her story. And it happens. So these angels show up, and they say there's going to be this child. It's going to be great. So the angels get up, and they're going to leave. And Abraham says, hey, where are you guys going? What's next on the docket for the angels? And they say, well, we're going to head up to Sodom because we've heard that Sodom is just the worst. And God is considering laying out his judgment on them and destroying the city. So we're going to go up there. We're going to see if the rumors are true. We're really interested how they're going to treat us. And then we'll see what happens. Maybe we'll blow them up. Maybe we won't. We'll see. And 2 of them go to leave, and Abraham kind of, grabs one of them and says, hey, man, can we talk? Got something for you. You see, Abraham was very concerned about Sodom because he had this nephew. His nephew is named Lot. For whatever reason, bad decision-making, I think, Lot decides he's going to move to Sodom. He had just recently moved to Sodom to live there. And so, this whole blow-up Sodom plan doesn't seem good if your nephew's there. So Abraham's like, look, you're speaking for God, right? Let's just make this a conversation between God and I. He says, okay, so you're going to destroy Sodom because everybody is terrible. Got it. I understand. I'm in support of that, actually. That would be a good thing because I've heard they're terrible. But you don't want to destroy righteous people as well as terrible people, right? And the angel's like, well, of course not. Of course, we don't do that. He says, okay, so what is your low threshold for people? What are we talking here? Let's say you found 50 righteous people. Would you spare Sodom for the sake of 50 righteous people? Because he's just worried about Lot. Okay, so that's one. So that would be within 50. So the angel says, yeah, God's great with that. We won't destroy anything for 50 people. Cool. And he goes to leave. And Abraham thinks about it for a second. Man, 50 is a lot. 50 is a good amount of people, especially in this world we live in with a very low population. He didn't say that part, but it's understood in the story. What if it's only 40? And the angel's like, well, I suppose, 40 is not that big of a difference from 50. 40 is basically 50, right? If you said we got about 50 people and it was 40, nobody would argue, right? Right, okay, so what if it's 40 people? If you find 40 righteous people, will you not destroy Sodom? And the angel's like, yeah, great, got it, cool. He's like, yeah, but, 40's real high too. 40's just a big number. 4 sets of 10? Man, what about 30? And they kept negotiating like this until it was 10. And they finally, I think the angel probably was like, do not push your luck, man. We got to 10. At the end, it was decided if there were 10 righteous people in all of Sodom, this massive city, it was just 10 righteous people, that God would not destroy it. So Abraham figures, okay, good. Well, I know that there's Lot, and like his wife, she seems cool. So now we're down to 8. We just got to find 8 more. And so there, he's got these daughters. He's gonna marry them off to these dudes. That's probably 2 more. That's 4. We just got to find 6 more. So Abraham, in his head, kind of doing some math, is figuring, okay, Sodom is safe. Sodom is safe. That's good. So this is all going on while the other 2 angels are traveling. So these 2 angels show up to Sodom. And they get to the gates of Sodom, and wouldn't you know it, the first guy they meet, just so happens for the story, that they meet Lot. Lot, this nephew of Abraham that Abraham just knows is absolutely righteous and this great guy. Have this huge argument just to make sure that, he's safe and everybody else is safe, right? So Lot welcomes the people to the town. Again, we're not sure if he knows that they're angels or they're not angels. Again, he seems to figure it out at some point, but we're not sure when. So let's just call them men, or we'll call them angels. You just know they're kind of men. And Lot's like, hello, stranger men. Friends, what are you doing in Sodom? And they're like, we're just here to visit. We'd love to spend the night here. He's like, great, you can stay at my house. We'll give you another meal. They're thinking, we're not even hungry. Why do these people keep feeding us? But we'll give you a meal. And I don't know if angels eat. I don't know how that works. So, but we'll give you a meal. You can stay with me. My family's great. My daughters are real nice. So, you guys will play Parcheesi. It'll be a great night. And the angels, they're all like, look, we're here. They're here for a test, right? So they said, we were just going to sleep in the middle of the town just outside. We kind of wanted to see what would happen. And when Lot heard that, he was horrified. Because it turns out Lot was totally aware of what was going to happen to them if they slept outside that night. And so he told them, oh gosh, no. Do not sleep outside. In fact, don't be outside after dark. Don't, actually. In fact, why don't you board your windows up when you're inside after dark? Don't go outside, please. This is Sodom. Do you know where you're at? So the angels agree to go to Lot's house, sort of proving his point. And if that didn't prove the point, well, now we get to the famous part. So Lot's got the guys in the house. They've had dinner. They're laughing. They're having a good time. And suddenly this angry mob shows up. This angry mob shows up. And it sounds confusing to us, or it sounds odd to us, because I think we have been conditioned by what we have done with the Sodom story in our world to see this as something that it's not. So we tend to think of this as this angry mob is people from Sodom who want to have sex with these men. That's what we tend to think when we think about the story. Because, that's actually what the Bible even says. They bang on the door, hey, bring these men out so we can have sex with them. A lot of our English translations, that's what they say. They're really not a great translation of that, but because that's not really what's going on. So it sounds confusing. We picture like a romantic or that kind of a thing. We just want to have sex with these men. We just can't control ourselves. And that's what we think of Sodom and Gomorrah because, we think of the term sodomy and, that kind of thing is what we think of. In fact, that's not what's going on. We should probably think about this. This is not about flowers and candy and Valentine's Day as much as this is about prison. This is about dominance. They didn't want to have sex with the angels or the men that they saw, or the angels they saw as men. They didn't want to have sex with them. They wanted to rape them. The idea was to exert their dominance. The idea was to put them in their place. The idea was to make sure they knew who was in control in Sodom. That's what they wanted to do. And we get this a little mixed up when we make it about sex, because that's not really what this is. There's no romance here. This is, in fact, this is just a show of force. This is the new guy on cell block D, and you got to make sure that he's, where he needs to be. So Lot, of course, is displeased because we don't know if he knows that they're angels or not. At this point in the story, it doesn't seem like it. These are just men that he has taken in because he's a good guy. And so he goes out outside, and he tries to reason with this angry mob. He's like, listen, this is crazy. Don't do this. You're not supposed to be like this. Why is this how Sodom is? This is not cell block D. What are you doing? And he says, by the way, look, I'll tell you what. These men are the guests under my home. If you need to rape somebody, I have 2 virgin daughters. You can have them. And see, that's the detail of the story that tells us everything we need to know about Sodom, because guess what? Lot was the most righteous man in Sodom. And his answer to a problem of men want to rape other men was, why don't we let them rape other women? That's his problem-solving strategy. He thought about this, guys, and he came up with that. And that's why Sodom is terrible. So the angels are like, yeah, we've seen enough. Miraculously blind the crowd and get out. They're like, get out. We're going to blow this place up now. By the time that the sun arose the next morning, the whole city is inflamed. Also, Gomorrah, we don't really see them in the story, but they're like a sister town. We're just led to believe they're just as bad. And so Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. They're terrible. It's awful. What an awful story. And really, if you like that story, get help. That's an awful, awful story. I hate that story. Which is why Jesus used it, by the way. Because Jesus was trying to make a point to these people about what they were doing and why. What Jesus was trying to say when he told these people, hey, on Judgment Day, Sodom is going to be better than Sodom would be better off than you. If Sodom had seen what we saw, that they would have repented. They would have been great. What he was trying to say is, you guys are just so wrapped up in sin. And here's why. As we've been discussing, in the ancient world, no one could read. That's not exactly true. In the ancient world, roughly 5 to 10% of people could read, which means somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 20 people could read, which tells us a lot about the way that they processed and interpreted and understood the scriptures. They could not do what we do. They couldn't just, what we've done already this morning, which is, read a passage. And, they couldn't just sit down, open up a Bible, look at chapter and verse, and understand what's going on. Or read it and think about it. That's not what it was. For them, the scriptures were all oral traditions. They were stories spoken out loud, told, and they were told in a group setting, right? So, you would bring it up, and somebody else would kind of argue. We talked about this last week, that, they could add to the story, they could take away from the story, that the way that they understood things was that this was a living, breathing kind of document. These stories were living and active and breathing, and they interacted with them, right? And so at the end of the day, what we need to understand as we're looking at the sermon series is that the way that we understand biblical concepts, very simple phrases. We might look at the Bible and look for a simple definition. We may look at the dictionary or a textbook and look for a very simple definition. But in the ancient world, that's not what they could do because they couldn't read. So if, for example, you were to ask an ancient person in the time of Jesus or in the 1,000 years before Jesus, hey, what does it mean to sin? What is sin? There is a very good chance, 90% chance, that they would say sin. Oh, well, we're talking about Sodom then. Because by the time between the writing of Genesis and the story, being spoken, a million times by a million people, by the time this happens, Sodom, that phrase, that city, this story becomes shorthand for just sin. Here's what I mean. So in the book of Deuteronomy, we read about Moses. Long time after the story of, chronologically, it's a long time after the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Moses he's about to die, and he's handing off leadership to Joshua, right? And so he gathers the people, and he's telling the people, hey, this is what's going to happen. And he kind of wants to give them a history lesson so they can learn from their past. And he goes through, kind of a summary of, the good times, the bad times. It's like a clip episode on a sitcom, right? And when he gets to the sin stuff, when he talks about the terrible things he's done, Moses described the terrible things that they had done in a very specific way. He says that they were attached to the vine of Sodom. That they were bearing the fruit of Sodom. Now that's really interesting language because Jesus talks about how we are attached to him as a vine, right? Like that's part of who we are as Christians, that he is the vine, we are the branches. And in John chapter 15, during the Last Supper, it's a really famous phrasing. Moses uses that same phrasing, that same picture to say, when you sinned, Israel, Sodom was the vine and you were the branches. A few hundred years later, there's a guy named Isaiah. Isaiah is a prophet. He is prophesying during a very bad time in which the people of Israel are very, very sinful. And it starts at the top, okay? It starts with the kings of Judah. He was concerned with Judah, the southern kingdom. And so the kings of Judah, Isaiah said, are incredibly sinful. They are so sinful, they are Sodom. The kings of Israel are Sodom. And then the people who follow the kings of Israel and they sin, guess who they are too? They're Sodom. Yep. And then there's going to be these Babylonians that are going to come and they're going to come a-conquering, and God's going to let this happen because of the sin of the people. But Babylon, they're really bad too, so guess what they are? According to Isaiah, yeah, you guessed it, they're Sodom. Over and over and over. I mean, every time Isaiah sees anyone who is sinning in virtually any way, he's like, oh yeah, they're Sodom. That's who they are. They're Sodom. That's just the way he looked at it. If you fast forward all the way to the end of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, man, the book of Revelation, such a misunderstood book, so much back and forth, but what we should all be able to agree on is that the book of Revelation shows us pictures, right? Allegories, metaphors. Well, there's this one part of Revelation where it talks about this beast that comes out of the sea. And the beast came out of the sea to wage war against two prophets of God. And what this beast is and who that prophets are, I mean, like everybody's argued about that forever. And it's real fun because the answer is like, yeah, we don't know. It's a metaphor. So anyway, there's this giant beast. There are these two prophets. And the beast wages war with the prophets and kills them. It's so sad. And just flings their bodies on a street. And on this street, it just so happens to be the very same street that Jesus was crucified in. Do you know the name of the street with the dead bodies of the prophets where Jesus was crucified? I'll give you two guesses. It's Sodom. Sodom. God's people, Old Testament, New Testament. When you're looking at an understanding of what sin is, people who couldn't read. In other words, they couldn't just, look at Romans 3 and say, well, it's that. Paul said this. When they understand what this all is, when they look at this, when they said, what does it mean to sin? They didn't look at this and say, let me look at a textbook because they couldn't read it. What they did is they said, it's like Sodom, that story we all know. So here's the question. There's a lot of stories in the Bible about a lot of people who do bad things. It's not like Sodom Gomorrah was the only story of judgment in the Bible. So why? Why does that story become synonymous with sin to Moses, all the way back to Moses, to Isaiah, the time of the prophets, to the New Testament with Revelation? Jesus is using it when he's frustrated with people. He's saying, hey, you're worse than Sodom. He's using it in that same way. Why is it Sodom? And the answer to that, I think, is really, really important. And it's given to us by another prophet living 100 to 200 years, somewhere in that neighborhood, after Isaiah, talking about many of the same things. His name's Ezekiel. This is what we read in Ezekiel chapter 16. A prophet centuries after Sodom and Gomorrah talking about Sodom and Gomorrah. He's talking about Jerusalem, and he says, you, Jerusalem, your younger sister was Sodom, who lived with her daughters in the south. But you have not merely sinned as they did, you quickly surpassed them in corruption. It's the same thing Jesus was doing. Ezekiel says, as surely as I live, says the sovereign Lord, Sodom and her daughters were never as wicked as you and your daughters. Sodom's sins were pride, gluttony, and laziness. while the poor and needy suffered outside her door. Guys, this is a really interesting passage. This is a really interesting thing, and I'll tell you why it's interesting. Sodom and Gomorrah, if you say the word Sodom and Gomorrah to modern Christians, the first thing they're going to think about is sex. We can't help it, okay? We have a word called sodomy in our language. We think of sex. It's what we're going to think of. We think of very specific indecent acts. I don't think that's actually a great reading of this passage, as I already just said. I don't think it's a great reading of the story because it's not about sex, it's about rape. And rape and sex are two different things. It's actually super important that we as, any human being recognize that rape and sex are two very, very different things. Regardless, though, of how I might feel, and regardless, though, of how modern Christians might feel, Ezekiel disagrees with both of us. Ezekiel disagrees with both of us. He says Sodom's sins were pride, gluttony, and laziness, while the poor and needy suffered outside her door. In other words, the people of Sodom lived high on the hog. They lived lives of luxury and excess. They had not only everything they needed, but they had everything they wanted. And while they were doing that, there were people who had nothing. There were people who needed help. There were people who needed mercy and kindness, and Sodom ignored it. Now, how does this fit with the story? Well, it's real simple. I think when we recognize this is a story in Sodom and Gomorrah of rape. I'm saying it's like cell block D. That's about dominance. It's about putting people in their place. It's about the powerful keeping power. It's about the rich staying rich. It's about people with everything, keeping everything, and not having to share with anyone. That's what went on in Sodom, and that was the root cause of all the sin that they committed. At the core of Sodom and Gomorrah was powerful, wealthy, rich people with everything they wanted, denying the basic needs of other people. Which is a real fancy way of saying they were selfish. Because when you break it down, that's really what that was. They were selfish. They didn't care how their actions impacted other people because all they cared about was themselves. They didn't care if they could share with people because, it doesn't matter what those people think. It doesn't matter what they want. It doesn't matter what they need because all that matters is me. That's all it was. The sin of Sodom was selfishness. And when we realize that, man, do things get interesting as we define what sin is. Because if Sodom becomes shorthand for sin to the Jewish people, and at the core of everything of Sodom is selfishness, then it's not too much to say that at the core of every sin is selfishness. I don't think it's too much to say that all sin is in fact selfishness. I don't think it's too much to say that at the end of the day, we could sit around and talk and say, and replace every time you see the word sin in your Bible, just cut it out and put the word selfish in it, and it's going to read just the same. Because at the end of the day, that's what sin's about. Sin is about us looking out for ourselves to the detriment of other people. Sin is about us not caring about the needs of other people. Sin is about us looking around and saying, it doesn't matter what they have, it matters what I have. It doesn't matter who I hurt, I just have to make sure I get it. And when Jesus looked at these people, who were being selfish, by the way, I mean, think about this. Jesus had given them more than he'd given anyone else, and they wouldn't even look at it. I mean, imagine what you would say to a child if you bought them the greatest Christmas present in the world, and they won't even open it. Here, have it, and they don't want it. That's what's happening here. Of course Jesus is frustrating. He's wasting his time. Jesus could have been doing those miracles in another city that would have actually cared. But they have monopolized his time, giving him the impression that they might care, when in fact they don't care. Because at the end of the day, they are selfish people who just were never going to repent. They were never going to change their minds. And so yeah, Jesus gets frustrated and Jesus gets a little bit mean. You guys are worse than Sodom, he says. Echoing what Ezekiel says in his prophecy, echoing what Isaiah says, echoing what Moses is. Calling people Sodom is a grand tradition of Jewish teachers. But on top of Jesus being mean, we need to see this. If you hear nothing else, I want this to be this. This is kind of the point of everything. While Jesus was being mean, Jesus was also being exceedingly, exceedingly kind. And the reason is because Jesus, one of his most famous phrases that he ever says to anybody, one of the most famous promises he gives to anybody, the kind of promise you might put in a song and we'd sing it, at church, that kind of a promise was actually spoken to these people. We were just in Matthew 11, yeah? This is also Matthew 11, just a few verses later. This is what we read. Jesus speaking to the people of Capernaum that he just said are worse than Sodom. He says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear. The burden I give to you is light." That was spoken to people he just called Sodom. Worse than Sodom. And here's what it means. Guys, there is the great lie of sin, is that it is in some way rewarding and in some way worth it. Yeah, okay, maybe I hurt somebody else, but if I'm selfish, I, at the end of the day, get what I want. And see, that is a lie. Jesus is talking to people that he has just established he believes wholeheartedly are selfish, and then to those people, he says, you are carrying heavy burdens. It is a burden to be so selfish. Trying to live a life, living this path of not only getting everything you need, but getting everything you want, and putting yourself above other people is a massive, draining, giant, the big ball on the chain, burden that we carry when we are selfish. When we put ourselves first, we think, okay, maybe it's bad, but the people getting hurt are those people, not me. The teachings of Jesus that they don't want to listen to, the teachings of Jesus that are the Word of God, tell us that selfishness, it's a burden. What a terrible weight to carry around, to always be putting yourself first. What a terrible weight it is to build a life around not caring about other people. And Jesus, in his kindness, says, come to me and lay it down. The burden I give to you is light, because there is no burden when we care for other people. There is no heavy chain attached to being selfless. Because what we're doing is the work of God. What we're doing is spreading love and compassion and mercy, and you can't do those things when you're selfish. You see, to me, I think this is a giant paradigm shift when it comes to our understanding of sin. Growing up, I thought that sin was the bad stuff that actually felt good. The stuff that they tell us not to do, but it's actually really cool. That's how I understood sin growing up. But if we start looking at these things the way that ancient people who couldn't read looked at things, sin is a burden. What a terrible place Sodom was to live. What a terrible thing it is to have to make sure you're always number one. What a terrible thing it is to always have to have everything you've ever wanted. How do you have time to do anything else? How do you have time for love? How do you have time to see beauty anywhere? Well, the answer, of course, is you don't. Sin is selfishness, and selfishness is a massive burden. And the gospel of Christ frees us of exactly that. This morning, we're in our second week of our series called Divine Words for the Illiterate. As we talk about these ancient people, defining terms through stories. If we define sin the way they did, which is through the story of Sodom, the way Moses and Isaiah and Ezekiel and John and Jesus, if we define sin that way, well, we have bad news and we have good news. And that's our lesson for this morning. Our second lesson from Divine Word for the Illiterate is this: sin is selfishness that becomes a burden in our lives. And Christ has called us to let it go. Sin is selfishness that becomes a burden in our lives that Christ has called us to let go. So when the musicians are going to come forward, we're going to sing a song. We offer this invitation each and every week. Take God up on this offer. The Bible teaches when we understand who he is that we are to repent to be baptized. Repent just means change your mind. And in baptism, we see a picture of that. We see a picture of that whole heart, mind, soul change. We go down in the water, it's our old selves being put to death, just as Christ was put to death. We get out of the water, turn to yourselves being born again, just as Christ was resurrected. We join with Christ. We are made brand new, and we are his. If you've ever made the decision, nice word baptistry, all sorts of people can do it, let's talk. If you're an immersed believer in Christ looking for a perfect church home, this place is not it, but we do serve a perfect God. We want to connect, we want to call, we want to cultivate, and more than anything else, we want to live lives that are not selfish. We want to live lives of selflessness, understanding that it is a burden. It's a burden to be like Sodom, and it is freeing to follow Christ. As we stand,